Please note this video contains content which some viewers may find distressing. This video is for educational purposes only. Pederasty in ancient Greece was the name given to a sexual relationship between an adult male and young boy, usually in his teens. But how was pederasty conducted? How common was it? And was it socially accepted? Welcome to History Insight, where we explore the hidden and lesser-known aspects of history. In this video, we will be discussing the horrifying truth of pederasty in ancient Greece. This is a dark chapter in history that is not widely discussed, but is important to understand and remember. If you enjoy this video, please hit the like button, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more content in the future. So what was pederasty in ancient Greece? Pederasty was a social custom in which an adult male would court a young Greek boy to become his model, guide, and initiator, and would become responsible for the evolution of his chosen young counterpart. The younger man, usually 16 to 18 years old, also called eromenos, would only enter such a relationship once they had undergone puberty. In antiquity, puberty occurred somewhat later than today, usually starting around first 4 for boys rather than first 2. The older man, or erast, was generally in their mid to late 20s. The erasts would always initiate the relationship, and they would do so by showering the eromenos with gifts. The erasts might be what you and I would call exclusively homosexual, but they might be married to a woman as well. And that is, of course, not unknown in our society today. Same-sex attraction and relationships have been a part of human history for centuries, and the form that these relationships have taken have varied throughout time. In ancient Greece, pederastic relationships were a common form of homosexuality. These relationships, which involved an older male and a younger male, were considered socially acceptable as long as there was a significant age difference between the two partners. Pederasty was so common in ancient Greece that it was considered the principal cultural model for free relationships between citizens. Furthermore, it played an important role in the education and development of young men. In these relationships, the older male would act as a mentor, guide, and initiator for the younger male. It's important to note that ancient societies had their own set of biases and beliefs, and it's important to understand that while pederasty was a common practice in ancient Greece, it is not necessarily something that should be replicated or glorified in modern times. It's also important to understand that the relationships were not always equal, and some may argue that it was exploitative. It's essential that we understand the historical context and acknowledge the cultural influences on relationships and sexual orientation, while also being mindful of the biases and prejudices of past cultures. Now over to homosexuality in ancient Greece. Homosexuality in ancient Greece. It's time to address the elephant in the room. How could it be that so many more people were homosexual or bisexual back then? Given that only around 3.5% of people identify as gay or bisexual today, how could it be that the majority of ancient Greek men experienced same-sex attraction? Isn't sexual orientation purely biological and therefore static and unchanging throughout history? The topic of sexual orientation is a complex and nuanced one, with many factors influencing its development. While some may argue that sexual orientation is solely determined by biology, the reality is that it is also shaped by culture. This can be seen in the variation of homosexuality across time and space, as human biology has remained relatively constant. It's important to note that this does not mean that sexual orientation is a choice, but rather that cultural influences play a role in its formation. Additionally, it is important to recognize that no sexual orientation is inherently normal or abnormal. All forms of sexuality should be respected and accepted. One cultural factor that can greatly impact the formation of sexual orientation is the presence of social pressure or stigma. For example, in societies where homosexuality is heavily stigmatized, individuals may be more likely to identify as heterosexual. This is because they may feel that they have to conform to societal expectations or fear rejection and discrimination. In contrast, ancient cultures such as Greece did not hold the same negative perceptions of same-sex relationships as many modern societies do. In fact, the concept of heterosexuality as we understand it today did not exist in ancient times. Same-sex relationships were not considered inherently deviant or immoral. However, it's important to note that ancient cultures also had their own forms of bias, such as the belief that relationships between men of similar age were deviant. This belief was rooted in the idea that there needed to be a submissive-dominant dynamic in same-sex relationships, which could only be achieved if there was a significant age difference. It's also important to recognize that ancient societies also held other biases, such as the belief that women were inferior to men, which is reflected in practices such as the marriage of young girls. This belief was rooted in the idea that women were not capable of making decisions for themselves and needed to be controlled by men. It's essential that we examine and acknowledge the cultural influences on sexual orientation, while also recognizing the biases and prejudices of past cultures. It is also critical to understand that society's judgment on certain practices in the past may reflect our own biases and prejudices. It is important to approach the topic of sexual orientation with an open mind and a willingness to learn and understand different perspectives. Only by doing so can we truly create a society that is inclusive and respectful of all forms of sexuality. It is important to consider that in ancient Greece, there was a different societal attitude towards same-sex relationships. Homosexuality was not seen as a taboo or deviant behavior, and it was accepted as a part of daily life. This cultural acceptance and lack of stigma may have played a role in the higher prevalence of homosexuality in ancient Greece compared to today. Additionally, it is important to note that ancient Greek society had different views on gender and sexuality compared to today. In ancient Greece, the concept of gender and sexual orientation as we understand it today did not exist. Instead, the focus was on the roles and power dynamics within relationships. This can be seen in the practice of pederasty, where the older male was considered the dominant partner and the younger male was considered the submissive partner. It is also important to consider that ancient Greek society placed a significant emphasis on education and personal development. Pederasty was seen as a way for young men to learn and grow, and the older male partner was expected to act as a mentor and guide. This cultural context and societal expectation may have also played a role in the higher prevalence of homosexuality in ancient Greece. In conclusion, while it is true that homosexuality has always existed among humans, the form and societal acceptance of these relationships have varied throughout history. It is important to understand the cultural context and societal attitudes towards homosexuality in ancient Greece and not to make assumptions or comparisons with modern society. It is also important to remember that while pederasty was a common practice in ancient Greece, it is not something that should be replicated or glorified in modern times, as it may involve exploitation and abuse of power. It's crucial that we understand the historical context, acknowledge the cultural influences on relationships and sexual orientation, while also being mindful of the biases and prejudices of past cultures. Thanks for watching our video. We hope you enjoyed learning something. Please drop a like, comment, and subscribe. We'll see you in our next video.